All right, everyone. Welcome to the September 2024 Product Roundtable. I am, as always, super excited, but even more excited than ever before to be hosting this because we have now three amazing guests, Joseph, Talia, and David, which is going to be super excited to get to hear from them and get to talk much less, which I always enjoy. And we're going to talk about two different features, one from Stumble Guys, the other from Mobile Legends, and they're both super interesting and different. So we're gonna meet the panelists, go over the feature, talk about the Stumble Guys, and then talk about the Mobile Legends Bang Bang feature. So I'm gonna kind of jump through this because this is not the as fun stuff, but quick intro because I think everyone knows you guys. But if they don't, the links here, and Jennifer will drop the LinkedIn links in the chat. We've got Joseph Kim. You want to kick things off with a little, quick little intro, and then Talia and David.
Sure. So I'm Joseph Kim, CEO of a company called Leela Games, working on a mobile extraction shooter and dating simulation game. And the Game Makers part is a newsletter and podcast that focuses on game development.
Awesome.
Okay,
Talia.
my name is Talia Shmuel, and I'm leading product and game design at Bring It On Games. We've got a skill-based bingo game and some other things in the works. Formerly, I worked at Plarium, where I was product market and sales director, and which pretty much meant I looked at everything in the entire market because Plarium went across the board, across all genres. So that's my approach towards gaming is look at the features rather than look at the genre.
Nice. And did you make the competitive intelligence one yesterday?
I was there briefly.
Oh, yeah, did you see your Reeve? Okay. Anyways, another Plarium alum. And David, thanks for joining us.
Hi, thanks for having me. Uh, I am making games at Magnetic, working with Philip Black, who's on Deconstructive Fun, and Tom Storr at the Experimentation Group, helping out game teams, consulting with game teams and helping them with anything from economy to feature stuff and experimentation stuff. And I started the Experimentation Group at King, where we did a bunch of crazy experiments with millions of players and had a lot of fun finding fun things that are now all over the place in casual and other games across the industry.
Nice. And
Thanks
Philip
for having
Black
me.
is,
I'm excited.
yeah. And Philip Black is also on our economy roundtable. So, and we're
That's right. I know
super
there's them.
excited. And we love having him. He's amazing. All right. So let's jump in here because we have a lot to talk about. And I always, think, oh, we don't have enough, but we definitely have enough today. We're going to talk about two different features, as I mentioned, the Stumble Guys and Mobile Legends. Jennifer will drop the reports in the chat as well, so you can, in the background, read about them. They're both, as you can tell and see in these images, cosmetic features. And first, we're going to talk about Stumble Guys. So we're going to go one and the other. And this is abilities. If you don't know Stumble Guys at this point, you're probably in the wrong round table. So I'm going to skip ahead of this. But it's a multiplayer battle royale party game. Players compete for the last man standing. Super fun game for all ages. Yeah, I'm not going to go into that. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the emotes. So the abilities reworked the game's interactive emotes. So that's a lot right there, but they basically took the emotes and added a feature to it. And it added a progression of 15 upgrades to each one. So each emote had 15 upgrades, which is a theme in both features. Players earn tokens from the base game. So the base game meaning just the core game, they earn tokens. That unlocked and upgraded abilities, okay, which is what these are. And then abilities are things like striking another player, turning invisible, sliding while running. I mean, kind of like your classic Mario Kart type mechanics, right? Like there's even one that's like the banana. And then players can buy IAPs to gain early access to certain abilities. So there's an advantage for payers, which we'll talk about. Previously, the app's special emotes allowed players to use these same abilities, but players couldn't upgrade them. and they were difficult to obtain without spending. So before we go any further, I have a couple questions for you guys. Just feel free to jump in if you have stuff to, and then in chat too, if you have questions, jump in. But um, what what kind of like questions or things do you think about when you're messing with the core game experience? Because that's like a big difference. This isn't just like an add-on feature. This actually changes the core base game experience. Is there anything that you guys think about or talk to the teams or anything like that when you're doing that?
Um, yeah, I've got a few thoughts, Brett. So the way that I kind of think about this kind of a thing, and to your point, adding permanent abilities is, very, very risky, especially for casual games. But I think we've seen in terms of an overall trend from whether it's from hyper casual to hybrid casual and from casual to now, when we see like more hybridization happening in games and the potential to add, for example, RPG progression mechanics to casual games, I think this is kind of like what we're seeing. And I think this is actually interesting in the sense that the previous product roundtable that you hosted in terms of the Brawl Stars Godzilla event, we kind of see two ways in which you could potentially add progression to these kinds of games, right? Which is one, having some type of progression and abilities tied to a temporary event type of thing, as well as what we're seeing with more permanent abilities. And I think what that's also suggesting is in terms of when you look at the current market today, and with the difficulties in terms of UA, for example, the higher your LTV, the more scale you're going to be able to achieve. And for similar games, in the same genre, the more that you're able to add monetization depth and having higher ARPU, you're going to be able to outcompete competitors. And so I think this is a very smart choice. I think these guys have done a great job in terms of adding these kinds of abilities. But I think the more interesting thing for me is like whether you could get away with permanent abilities or going more of a Brawl Stars Godzilla, more temporary type of event-based progression.
On my side, when I looked at this, I actually was thinking first of the strategy market, not the RPG market. Because generally in RPG and mobile, when upgrade is done, it's done across the board for a character. So you do one upgrade, it upgrades everything. Whereas here you were able to pick and choose and decide which one you were doing partway through. So it wasn't until you reached the very end where everything was maxed out to 5, once you were leveled up to level 15, that at that point, everybody is the same. You actually had the control over what decisions you were making, what you're doing. The first time I saw this was actually in a game called Mafia City. And we're talking about back in 2014, where you could go into your characters and pick and choose which aspects you were going to do. Here it's the time, you've got the magnetic, you got the different elements to pick and choose. And so it's a strategic choice about how you're approaching and what you're approaching in order to customize the character for yourself. Now, when you're doing this within the game for, the midway players, as long as you haven't maxed out, it is interesting. However, once you reach the end game, and you'll have a lot of end game players who will max this out pretty quickly for the different heroes, you're going, as you were saying, it's risky. That at that point, okay, now everything's maxed out. There's no customization in there anymore. So this has lost its interest. Where is it going to go from here to keep it going, keep it interesting in the long run? Once you start adding all these different customization features into different areas, the complexity becomes so difficult. And this is like we see this going back to the RPG that you were talking about, where most RPG games, the way they do customization is everything you add in adds, let's say, 15%, 20%. So all the powers split equal across the board. So players have to pick and choose with what they're going to do, what they're going to customize, what they're going to put their power and energy into. But The one game that did not do it that way was Marvel Strike Force with the red stars, where the red stars leveled up 75% and had the major increase. So when games like this are adding in something and then they're going to add something else and it's going to take away from this in the long run, it's just going to keep getting pieced out further and further.
Sorry, one other comment, because Talia, as you mentioned, complexity made me think of something which I thought was a very smart design choice from the Stumble guys, developers, which is when you think about complexity, and especially for a casual game, to your point, anytime you introduce a new system, new set of UI, new kind of thing into a game, it does increase that complexity, which I think that game developers need to be really cognizant about their players. And so I just felt like the choice they made here, which was to actually integrate abilities into an existing system, right? The emote system, so that you don't create a separate thing, which then, to your point, would like increase complexity, have more things to confuse the players. So I thought that was a really smart design choice. But yeah, just wanted to add that point in as you were talking about.
It's a good question, Natalia. How much does it scale? I mean, how many abilities can you have? Can you upgrade to like 100 or whatever? So your top players are just going to eat through this stuff immediately. You're going to get a little monetization bump. The rest of them maybe it takes them some time to understand if they want to get involved with it or not. How interested is the system? But then are you going to like chase the people that already maxed it? Are you going to add another 15 and another 15 to keep it deep for them? I mean, so one of the problems is probably it's limited how deep it can be. Or do you
That's a
think it's
great,
like,
yeah, that's a great point, David, because I've seen this in one of my favorite games, is Clash Royale, which it basically is never ending, right? Like they continue to do these modifications. And then for someone like me that just fell in love with the original like core game, there's definitely moments where I'm like trying, I'm very frustrated because I like have to continually relearn the game. Whereas for me, I want it to feel like chess, where I'm just mastering the game of chess, right? It's not like I have to learn a new piece. And to your point, if they're not careful, 3, 5 years from now, this game could be completely different. And they have such a great core game, right? So there's like a danger in there. I love what you're saying. You're like, what's the long-term vision for this? Like it might give you a short-term bump, but like how does this level up your revenue for long term and how does your game work for the long term?
yeah, I mean, you can see that in games. I mean, there's the app stores littered with games that have put in really exciting new features and gotten a nice little bump, and then it just goes away because there's no depth to the system. I mean, I play a lot of Marvel Snap. I think it's interesting with the like with the cards there. The my son and a bunch of his friends play, and I kind of keep up with it. But like you can upgrade the cards, and it's really just looks. It doesn't change the abilities. But the looks like there's like they end in this end state where it can be like yellow or like ink or like, and there's different things around it. People like some of them and don't like some of them. So you end up with this thing that I can just dump stuff into, and there isn't really like it doesn't affect the actual game, and it's just eating up the things that I'm earning, but it feels like it's worth playing or something. So it feels like it's a much deeper. Not that they monetize particularly well, but you can dump a ton of stuff into it. Whereas this might end up feeling deep, but like it, the most engaged players hit the ceiling pretty quick. What would you guys do differently? I mean, I'm just happy that I think it's cool there's progression in there, so that all of a
Yeah,
sudden there's like a progression element. That's awesome. It's just maybe not super deep, but maybe it is deep, deeper than I see it, or maybe they've got a plan for making it super deep. But like, would you guys adjust it? I mean, what would you guys do to do differently with it?
I'm not sure if it's like, and I don't know the game well enough, but like maybe one point around. I think that might be good to discuss is in terms of like the impact of abilities, right? Which is two things come to mind without going deeply in terms of like the gameplay itself, because I haven't played Stumble Guys a lot. But like the first thing is when you have for certain genres of games, and depending on your geo, there's a certain kind of mentality around pay to win. And so certainly when you have these abilities that potentially can rely fairly significantly on IP purchases, that there could be a negative perception by players around pay to win mechanics for this kind of game. And so that really just depends on the genre and the specific situation. But I also think the other thing to keep in mind, and one of the things that we've seen in a number of games when you add abilities and a potential power gap between players, is this notion of having potentially unbalanced gameplay or to create a split in your player base, which then would complicate matchmaking and when you're trying to match different kinds of players and to potentially stretch out, for example, your ability to match depending on the number of players that you have. Now, I assume Stumble Guys has so many players that matching and things of that nature are likely not a key concern for them, but certainly for other games where you're introducing power gaps and could potentially have difficulties in matching, unless you've got great bot tech, it would also be a key design risk, in my opinion.
I think one of the questions in regards to that, in regards to adding in features like this, is who are their core audience? Who are their primary focus? Because I mean, they started on PC. They didn't start on mobile, where a majority of the casual players are. And so, while a lot of their players are casual now, I mean, my 12-year-old daughter plays it, but who is it that they're thinking about as the core players, and who is it who's paying the most money of the players? And catering towards that particular audience and moving in that direction.
So Lucas had a good point that he thought, to be honest, the game monetizes so poorly at the moment that he understands the move. So his argument is that they're basically just changing the game to make it monetize better because they can't compete potentially, like you were saying, Joseph. We have a question here from Richard. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts about transmog glamour mechanics. Parentheses, changing the visuals of the items, like keeping their effects. Asking because I see that linking effects to cosmetic items risks decreasing players' self-expression over min-max. Okay, I kind of get that question. Does anyone have any thoughts on that?
I think do you mean like just maybe Richard, what you're talking about is like if you have self-expression in a thing, so like emotes are just they don't affect gameplay, but you do it. And then if you're progressing in those things, you can do fun things in the game or whatever, but it doesn't affect the actual game. And you can pay for them. It won't affect the gameplay, so it doesn't make any difference. And then you make them abilities, and now I start making plans for how I'm going to play the game and min-maxing to try to win things. Is that what you mean? That messes up that balance? You can write in the chat if you're still.
Or does he mean that there might be a cool shirt that has lower abilities, but an even cooler shirt that, yeah, I assume that's what he means? Oh, right. Yeah.
Yes, they choose the emotes because of their effects, not because of their visuals. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I mean,
exactly.
that's kind of what's interesting about both of these features is like, what is the motivation, right? Is it cosmetic and glory and all that stuff, or is it competitive, right? Or is it mastery because there's like progression element, and then it's back with the leaderboards and the core loop, right? So it's like they're hitting so many different things, and that's not necessarily a bad thing, but to get all those right, it's pretty hard as a designer. And to your guys' point, like it'd be better if they tested it, did it as a event, saw how the like everyone reacted, tuned it, and felt about it, and then if it was amazing, then go to adding it to the core loop or core game experience, right? Not the core loop, but the core game experience, because this is kind of risky. Like there's once you do this, really hard to turn back, right?
Yeah, I mean, the way that I think about that question, Richard, and I think is a great point that you're bringing up is that it like depending on the game, I think there's going to be a specific orientation towards a preference. Like for an RPG game, even though like your the a set of armor might have if it has better abilities, even though it doesn't look as cool, you'll probably choose that set of armor and be happy with it. And for a game that's more casual or cosmetic in nature, I think you may prefer the look and feel relative to the abilities. But I do think that in this case, because they're emotes and are not like permanent on your body, like a like an outfit, that I think that the developers made a pretty good choice in terms of where to integrate abilities.
I think it depends in part on the player itself, that individual players are going to approach it different ways, and depending on the origin, the background that they're coming from, and what it is. So it doesn't really matter, you're not catering to everybody with all these different features. You're catering to whoever it is that it's interesting to. And it widens the audience. Whoever it is who's going to be interested will be, focus on that area. And if you're interested in another area, you'll focus on that area.
Yeah, but isn't maybe the question, Richie, you have to chime in again if you want, but like tying the two things together maybe kind of sucks. Like if let's say, I mean, just if we make this more general, I'm playing a game and I like ability A, and ability A looks like A, visual A, and I don't like visual A. Maybe I'll still choose to use ability A because I want to play with that ability, but I don't like visual. But if all of a sudden I can now upgrade it as I use it, and then I know, hey, it'll change, so I'll play it and I'll earn some points, and then I can upgrade it, or maybe I can pay to speed that up because I want to speed it up, and I can change what it looks like. Then it's like separate. I'm making my decision on what I want as an ability, and then I can upgrade the visual of it. That makes sense. And then the question is like, how much depth is there in it? And when you start putting in these abilities, are you going to be able to put in new ones? Are they going to be expensive? Stuff like that. But tying them together might be a bit of a problem. Like if ability A always looks like, I mean, what's that? What does it change like? And how do I decide how I want to be engaged in the game? I mean, there's some games where looking like you don't care is like cool. Like I haven't upgraded my stuff. I don't care about nothing. That's like, that's a statement by itself. I
The
mean, I
poop,
live
the
life
poop
like that.
skin. Yeah, the poop skin that was so big and like, yeah. I wonder if this is has something to do, at least strategically, with IP integration. I mean, we talked about the Godzilla event and that being very successful, and that was like an IP event for Brawl Stars. And I wonder if this makes IP integration much deeper. They can go like kind of sell to those partners like this much more integrated experience where their IP is going to have emotes, it's going to have like progression and things like that. So it's much more integrated than, oh, we're just going to like reskin the game, right? So I can see that being a strategic argument, right?
There are a couple things with integrating IPs. It's not, as you said, you reskin the game, it's temporary, and at least it brings a lot less weight. Each IP that wants to go into a game wants something unique of theirs to remain, so it has a longer effect on the game overall. In a game like this, without having the skins, in this type of way, I'm sorry, not skins, the abilities, it ties it even deeper into how the IP works and what's going the IP. And so you have the skins that hang on, you've got the actions that you actually know. I mean, you know, Optimus Prime always has the specific voice about it, and different things that are always going to work in this manner, that you can tie it across the board. He's always going to move in that way. And so it gives a lot more breadth about what can be done with the IP by doing that, as opposed to just adding skin that, get, okay, I've got the picture on top of it. Now let's move on to the next.
I was thinking about the question. Brett asked something about working with, like messing with the core game. Be interesting to hear your guys' thought about that. Also, like I mean, in puzzle games, the core is very like holy that it needs to like make sense and stuff like that. Throwing something in that creates randomness, if the game hasn't had a lot of randomness, can mess with things. So I mean, it is kind of an interesting question of like how much do you want to mess with your core game? I mean, speed chess is like barely taken off. I imagine if we decided to add a new piece that did different things in chess, it probably wouldn't get adopted by any chess player at all. Um, Whereas like in some games, messing with the core and putting in new people is like a regular. I mean, that's a regular thing. It feels like for this game, I think you could probably mess with stuff often. Like messing with the core game is probably expected. uh, in this game. That something funny and new comes out and everyone tries it out seems natural. So I mean, I wouldn't be worried in a game like this to mess with the core game. Would you?
Um,
It's not chess.
yeah, I mean, I think I agree with you, David. It just probably the thing that developers who are considering this type of situation or this kind of feature should consider is that, the impacts as kind of previously discussed in terms of like power gap, but as well as like now you've signed up for having abilities that you're not going to get perfect, that you're going to have to monitor, listen to player feedback, adjust. And so you've signed up for a new kind of feature treadmill or power treadmill that you're going to have to adjust and watch over time. And certainly the risks that we talked about or that I mentioned, whether it's like a perception of the game being more pay to win that could turn some players off, as well as if these abilities impact the core gameplay in a way in which players no longer believe that skill is or their perception of their skill in the game is as relevant because of these abilities that could potentially be overpowering, then that could also have a potentially negative impact. But the end result, I agree with you, David, is like it does seem like they should do something to potentially improve monetization, increase ARPU, potentially try to get to a greater level of scale. But yeah, they've now signed up for, some additional difficulties and challenges, which are all reasonable, but these are things that they've now signed up for.
There are two different things that, approaches that can be done to mitigate this without actually readjusting the abilities, though. And that is number one, that different abilities work in different ways, and are useful in different modes. So players can actually pick and choose which one they're using going into a mode. You don't necessarily want to stay on level 15 if you have level 15 open, if level 10 is going to be more useful somewhere else. The other thing that, and I don't know if they're doing this or not, I didn't check it, but do they, when they're doing matchmaking, matchmake according to with or without abilities? You've got the completely free to play players who have no abilities, but you might want to show the low level abilities so they go, oh, this is still reachable, but I want that. But in the long run, making sure it's leveled out so that you don't have people churning with how you're doing the matchmaking. And I didn't dig deep enough in to know to check to see if they're doing it or not, but it is a possibility, and it does mitigate that to some extent.
Yeah, maybe the one thing I would have done differently if I were the Stumble Guys folks would be like to David's point about this abilities potentially being high risk. I probably would have taken a page out of the Brawl Stars playbook and done this as a limited time event tied to maybe some IP integration, and then tried it out on a temporary basis. And then if players really reacted positively and you're able to see, okay, do these abilities totally screw things up for players or not at scale? Then if it tested positively, then I would have implemented on a more permanent basis.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
it might be useful to think of like the context of the situation, right? Like you were saying something before, getting ARPU up so that UA is possible. Like so you have a reasonable LTV thing, which they didn't really need because the game came out and blew up. So I mean, game comes out and blows up, and then has been shrinking since then. I mean, I haven't looked at the numbers really carefully, but something like that, and mostly organic driven, I guess. Like, I mean, again, not a careful business review, but not very UA driven. And if you compare that to casual titles uh, in general, usually they have to get through some sort of like LTV is better than the CPI gauntlet. So they've never really gone through that gauntlet with this game. Is my guess. And so now it's kind of like partly maybe some sort of attempt to retrofit it. Like what system could we have that would drive ARPU enough to have LTVs that are good enough that some marketing could be done for it? And I mean, it's an interesting situation because you get super broad. I mean, a lot of people know about the game, and clearly you're in a company with the financial tools to be able to push a game if you can get the economics right. So that's probably what you're trying to do as a team is like, how can I get my how can I get my LTV to look reasonable, my ARPU up so that this game can be invested in and we can continue to scale it. And it wouldn't surprise me if they're thinking systematically, like you're saying, Brett, like let's get some system in that improves monetization, but is based on engagement. So, I mean, if I understand it right, it was mostly IAP to get this before, but now you can earn it through engagement, which means you can use purchases to speed it up probably, but it doesn't necessarily pay to win. So you get this sort of like, you get rid of the sort of ugly like it's paid and that's why you have it thing. But then I mean I think the question remains, is it deep enough to really drive ARPU growth, and do you have a production plan to be able to drive it forward so that you can keep introducing these things, and will it, like you've been saying, just will it destabilize things too much, or like what's going to happen with the game. But my guess is it's just not going to be deep enough. Like if I had to take a guess on it, it's like not going to jump the ARPU up enough. And the most engaged players will just burn through it and stop. So you won't get much out of the most engaged, and then you'll be relatively low engagement with it. Means that the rest of your ARPU doesn't go up very much. So
It also might have brought
little
back,
bump and it goes down.
it might have also
Sorry.
brought back more players though. Their original who came over from PC at the very beginning, the early players are always the strongest in the game. And it might have been that they were trying to retarget those players as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think
And it's cool if the game is different also. Like if there's a new thing in the game and these new abilities, and you can put in abilities that are fun, maybe the game's more fun too, and you re-engage people from that.
Yeah, I think one other thing to think about is if we were to put ourselves into Scopely's shoes and think about how they're viewing this game, my suspicion, and I could be wrong about this, is that Stumble Guys likely was a game that had a large number of organic downloads, but potentially from a UA perspective, they, again, this is just speculation on my part, but likely they were not able to acquire a lot of like paid users on a profitable basis at scale. And so I think there may be some thinking from the Scopely side about what kind of a game is Stumble Guys. Is it a portfolio feeder game that where you're attracting a lot of organic installs that you can then push to your other more profitable games or higher LTV games? Or now are you thinking, actually, we want this game to stand alone and to be able to do significant user acquisition at greater scale so that this becomes more of a profit center type of game rather than a feeder game?
Yeah, just going back to, David, something that you said is this isn't chess, and I get the sentiment for sure. This isn't chess. Chess is obviously one of the greatest games ever made, but I do think that if you look at some of the games that have been on mobile, they're up there. And actually, in one of the roundtables we discussed like some of the games being like chess, right? Like someone made the argument that Clash Royale is as good as chess. And we do see games like Clash of Clans, Candy Crush making money for decades, right? Over a decade and likely multiple decades. And in that way, they are sort of like chess, where you could imagine these games like making money for honestly a century or maybe centuries, which is like kind of crazy. I mean, obviously, it might be in other iterations, it might be on different platforms. I know it's like a weird thing to think, particularly when we started in Zynga days, where it was like, oh, this is a hits driven business. We're going to take a game, we're going to launch it, we're going to make a lot of money, throw it away, we're going to go to the next game. But that really ended up being wrong. So I guess my point is, I'm not sure we shouldn't start thinking about some of these games as if they're like chess. And if so, then to your point, your second point, which is you should be really careful about a short-term bump that may impact the core experience. This one is sort of like soft, right? Like it's adding abilities that kind of make sense. It's very, as we talked about, Mario Kart-ish. But then the counter to your point is like how many of these like Mario Kart mechanics actually are there, right? Like that ends up stopping at some point. There's only so many bananas or speed ups that they can actually add. So if it works, it's just like a short term change. So a lot of interesting things on this feature.
Yeah, that's I think when I was saying it isn't chess, I meant in a like design way. Like in chess, if you innovated and threw in a new piece, it would freak everyone out. I mean, in poker, I mean, I think poker is actually a really interesting example. If you all of a sudden introduced a new card, called a thimble or something, no poker player would play it, no card player, no gin rum player, no one would go near it. And even Skippo, which is like innovation on card games, is really just the exact same deck of cards with a wild card in it. It's nothing different. So, but with poker, it's completely fine to innovate and like Omaha high low. Like you could do all sorts of fun variations on the way that cards set up in the beginning. That's accepted to players. And there's tons of variations there, but you can't put a new card in. So I think that like, and I mean, in chess, there isn't a lot of it. The variation is in the gameplay itself or whatever, and how you play. That's where the innovation is. And then they added like speed chess, and now there's a few more things. And now there's like computers coming in, but you don't change the game piece. So I think that there's a question of like, what kind of game do you have? And I mean, I think here you could probably mess around a lot with the core game, because I think most of the times you play the game for like to have some fun, and unexpected is okay in a game like this. And I think that if that's maybe a question you'd have for yourself. What is it what's the expectations for players when they come in here? I mean, I know some puzzle games I've worked with. Some puzzle players, there's no, if you look at like some of the clickers and the way that they're structured, you don't want no surprises. I've got a strategy for I'm going to click down this pile and empty it. Whereas in a game that's like a match three, there's pieces falling, there's some random stuff happening, and I'm okay with that, and I can live with that. So I think in this game, there's probably room for some more random, and maybe that's like more of a ticket. Like, I mean, I don't know. I need to spend a lot more time with the game, but I might lean towards how much randomization can we get in here where it's still fun and you still feel challenged, you still feel like there's some element of skill, but like I can throw some random stuff in here, and I know some things are going to be unexpected, and I want to log in and find out what else is happening that's unexpected. Um, yeah. Anyway, so that's an interesting thing to ask as a game developer: how much unexpectedness, randomness, am I willing to throw into the game? Is it still fun, or am I going to ruin it? I'm sure you would be unhappy if all of a sudden we put a bunch of weird things into Clash Royale, so a bunch of unexpected stuff happened, and the ending was random a bunch of times. That would make you very unhappy. You wouldn't like that at all. So it's different.
I think that's one of the key things with innovation, though, is that anything can be innovated upon. And if you find the audience who it will appeal to, you've got it. The question is, how big is that audience, and can you reach them? And that is the key in the market going forward, because it's sad of me to say, but how much new is there really out there? And the answer is very little. It's all about this tiny little thing that you tweaked in this way and stuck an IP on it. And now you have a multi-billion-dollar game that is hitting the top of the charts. It's all about finding the balance of what does and what doesn't work with the audience you're trying to reach.
Plus, like, yeah, but it's super hard to innovate when you have so much risk, right? So it's going to be very hard for them to innovate on the core game experience. And I think now that I'm thinking about the future, if I was, the lead PM or something, to David's point, I would take this concept what they presented and say, okay, well, and I always said, like, how does this work 100 times or 1,000 times, right? Like, how does this? And if you ask that question to me, it is multiple game modes, right? Which we've seen in Brawl Stars and other games. And with AI and the ability to, build experiences that feel like you're competing with other players, what I probably would do is say, okay, first let's build a system that can create an experience that feels like you're competing against real players, right? Like if they don't have that already, which I'd be surprised, right? Then you have concurrency, right? You have the kind of fake concurrency of playing against other players. With that system, we can now go create any different innovative mode we want, test it out, have players play it, see if they like it. If they like it, we can put it into the core loop. And then that creates a very easy way to innovate, because innovation is is really associated with risk, right? Risk reward. And it doesn't stack up here in this kind of system. I get your point about innovation, but it's certainly not going to happen if every time you want to try something, you could just like alienate your whole core player base.
I don't know if they did A/B testing though. We talked about event, running it as an event earlier, but did they do A/B testing on it? It's possible that they did. I didn't see it, but they might have. And made the decision.
Really hard to A/B test something like this. I mean, because you're gonna have half of the players be irate that they don't have the emotes. Like, yeah, I mean, I think that's where events is like a very great like system, like an A/B test, right? It's like a pre-post test, or it's a comparison, or you can just look at the metrics of players playing that. But I just don't think you can A/B test this, right? Because you just can't release it to 10% of the players. It's going to get in the community and they're going to say, like, well, why don't I have this feature? And blah, blah, blah. So
It's different.
But
Sorry, go ahead.
no, I was going to veer. You go ahead. Sorry.
I was going to say different games do A/B testing in different ways. Sometimes it's an entire server. Sometimes it's through matchmaking, and so that players are doing against each other. So there are ways of testing it out on a small scale for a short period of time, saying, okay, this isn't going to break it, then we can launch it. And honestly, skill play can throw, if they lose, with the revenue of what Stumble Guys is doing, comparatively speaking to other things that they have in their portfolio, if it doesn't work, okay, move on to the next thing.
Well, we've managed to talk 40 minutes about this feature. Congratulations. We weren't gonna have
I got one more thing before we go. Just one more
okay.
question.
Yeah, no. We can't.
Sorry.
I mean,
I had to
like
secretly sneeze and
yeah,
then
okay,
start,
go ahead.
sorry about
Go
this.
ahead.
All right.
Yeah.
Okay. So just like I wonder what you guys think about this. If I should think about it more properly, and then instead of making a fool of myself live like this, but let's make a fool of myself. This is can you have some sort of axis, like one of these nice little things where it's like, how innovative is this? How big of an impact does this have on a player's experience? And how likely, like, how good is it for engagement or modernization? Like, or not how good is it, but how like impactful will it be on that? And that's the problem, I think, with like innovative stuff. Because if you want to do something that has a huge impact on your revenue or on your engagement, it would be massive. You're probably going to have to take something that's going to have a huge risk on your on the game. It's going to impact the game a lot. And so the more you move up that axis, like I mean, if somebody says you got to double the ARPU of this game, and you're like, okay, I'm going to release this little system where you go into settings and you get to choose something. It's like, well, nobody's going to see that, so it's not going to work. They're like, yeah, but it's not going to ruin it. Yeah, but that's great, but it's not going to do anything. So you have to impact the game like strongly. And then probably one of the best skills for a game maker is, how can I do something that's very disruptive to the game, or like disruptive like it's going to make the game feel new or different to people, and yet it's going to have very limited downside and a lot of opportunity for upside. And you really need to know your audience and be able to take a risk on something that you think is like, it's really going to matter. So how do you move up that scale of like very disruptive to the game without it being, where it's higher on the disruptive on the positive side? And usually I think you should start with engagement. I mean, that's my feeling, is like, put something in that you think is going to make the game a lot more exciting and interesting, that has some depth of monetization. And if you put something in that's disruptive with no monetization, you're wasting your time or whatever. Like, sorry.
Here's where the competitive research comes in when you do it from the user testing standpoint. Because before you even put something like this into the game, did they check over what players were saying? They might have had a ton of players saying, hey, I want to customize my heroes more. And, they ran surveys on it. And so that is ways as well of easing it in. And then when they release it, say, hey, you guys were asking for it, so here you are, a gift to you. And suddenly, even if the players didn't like it as much, they go, oh, because we were asking for it, it's good.
Yeah, yeah.
I
But I
think
mean, it's also
we're
like
getting
that's
into
dangerous.
yeah, and not to totally veer, David, but to me, this is the role of the product manager. So to me, the product manager is the sort of the person who looks at the expected value, which is what that equation is, right? Like a potential lift, cost, risk, goes through each of those variables and then breaks it down into how can I increase the EV, the expected value of this by doing different things like A/B testing it, releasing it as an event, getting user research, talking to players, etc. And that was, I mean, that was like what Pincus and Zynga was sort of built upon. What they didn't have in that equation was the risk. The risk was always very low. Like they always wanted a 90% confidence interval, which is the opposite of risk, right? A confidence meaning likelihood to be successful. And when we did the roadmaps, everything was 90 plus. And if you failed, it was like devastating. So you ended up having these roadmaps of, to your point, of extremely safe, very accurately predicted
Proven small. Yeah.
modifications. And the roadmap never had that like risk variable, the confidence interval, where you could say, hey, there's a 10% chance this is going to work. But we think that if we throw, bananas all over the screen or whatever it is, that it's going to give us a 10% lift. Okay, are we willing to take this? Great. How can we mitigate this risk? How are there? And then, Pincus would say, like, how are the 10 different ways you've tested this, to Talia's point? Like, did you do surveys? Did you do an MVP? Like, we would do crazy stuff where, like, we would put up, like banners that said, like, play this game with emotes, and you click on it and it'd be like, oh, this isn't built yet. Like, it was to an extreme. But I really do think this is like the product manager's role. The game designer's role is to really think about like what is going to be innovative, and then obviously research comes in, all these other things.
Hey,
Yeah,
Brett, I'm not
that's
sure
my
if we're wrapping.
soapbox.
Oh,
Yeah.
sorry. I'm not sure if we're wrapping on this, but one slide you kind of scrolled through really quickly was around the ranked mode, and I thought that was one insight that
The
you
what?
the ranked mode.
Um,
Maybe
oh, the
one.
competitive mode. Yeah, here you go. Yeah.
Uh, you're actually, can you go one more slide? I thought I saw something about ranked. Oh yeah, this, okay. So I thought this was also a good decision by the Stumble Guys folks, where I think it's important that by introducing this ranked mode, basically a ranked progression player chase, that you have to have kind of like both sides of the equation match, right? So you're not just introducing abilities, but then now you're also introducing this player chase that would take advantage of the abilities. And so for game developers to also consider when you're introducing these kinds of things, to not you're not just selling weapons, right? You also need a war to use the weapons. But I thought that was an interesting point that was highlighted here, and something for game developers to also realize when they're introducing these kinds of features.
This certainly speaks to the ARPDAO or ARPU thesis, right? I mean, a competitive mode, abilities that you can purchase, IP integration, like those are all clearly ways of potentially increasing the ARPDAO of this game.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great point. The one counter to that, I will say, having built leaderboards actually on Zynga Poker, and the interesting thing is product managers, people at Scopely's, like, people that are on these games tend to be much more competitive than their player sets, even players who play competitive games. So I worked on Zynga Poker, and you think, well, these people are super competitive, right? Like playing poker, it's competitive. Well, when I did user research on a lot of our high-ranking players who were spending a lot of money, they would actually be doing chat with their friends at the table and tell them that they had really good cards that they would fold because they didn't want to like beat their friends. So what they were doing was they were using other people as their gauge for how good they were, but not as much as I want to destroy this other person. It was like a way to judge how well they were doing. And, product managers, people in competitive industries like gaming tend to be the opposite. They tend to be the ones like, oh, of course I want to like, and it's not that that doesn't exist, but I generally feel like the people creating these features are much more competitive than their player set, and that bias gets like pushed into the feature set, and you constantly see these things come out like leaderboards and things like that for more casual games. And sometimes I get very concerned about that. By the way, we're just going to talk
Yeah,
about
I
this
mean,
feature because we only have 10 more minutes. So don't even worry about like paying legends. I mean, there's no way we're going to get to that feature. We could talk about it for a few seconds on a different integration, but like it's just going to be too much. So let's just talk about this for the next like 5, 10 minutes. And then I think this discussion's been awesome.
on like hardcore competitive versus like let's have some random fun. You can always look at like what has a bigger DAO, chess or the lottery. I mean, because the lottery does, but like a long shot. Like chess is annoying. You win or lose. You get unhappy afterwards. You get proven if you're smart or not. Lottery is like, you know, just unlucky. You try again. It's fine. So I
That's a
mean,
really
I think
interesting
competitive
thesis,
stuff.
David. I would love to have our team like research that, right? Like, is the thesis that a game that is competing against yourself or not another person more likely to be our high revenue game?
It's not competitive. I think what I mean is if you think there isn't, if you think there's a random element to it, then doing it again is not a big deal because maybe this time I'll win. Doing it again, not a big deal. I mean, we don't need to dive too deep into it, but having worked on poker also, I mean, one of the reasons why poker has worked well is because a lot of people play the game thinking that was just unlucky. It'll be fine next time or whatever. So there's this like out of it where I've never lost a chess game and thought that was unlucky. I've generally thought like, yeah, that person destroyed me. That sucked really bad. I mean, that's a major difference. So, I mean, when you're doing a competitive thing inside of a game that's pretty casual, if it is clearly competitive and the best person is there, I mean, there's a problem with leaderboards. The person gets to the top and they always stay at the top, and it's hard to catch up to them. And there's no casualness to it. There's no reason for me to engage in it. It becomes not a very good driver of a broad engagement. Like maybe the top three people care, but usually they don't even because they've already sorted who the most crazy are early on, and then the rest of it just sails through. So I think that you got to be careful with leaderboards.
I completely agree.
I'm
Having
obviously
designed
scarred.
it, no, having
Yeah,
designed it myself too, I completely agree. It's a huge problem, right? And that's where clubs sort of came into and leagues
yeah,
and these
well,
things where you can like bracket people into different sections as opposed to having this leaderboard. Right. Like Zynga Poker, we was like one person had a gazillion coins and the second person had a million. Like
yeah,
it was meaningless. And it was only relevant to 10 people or 50 people or something
yeah,
like that. And I had to
yeah,
like build
exactly.
this whole system around it. And that's where you see like friends and all this other stuff. But even friends, it's like one friend might be amazing at it. Um, the other interesting thing to add to that is I think if you're going to add something like this, I sort of talk about football in this way is like you want it so that the end game, the end of the game has an ability to change the outcome more dramatically so that, even if you're behind, there's that chance, like there's still a chance that you could come from behind and have this thing happen. It could be lucky. I mean, you see that. Whereas I mean, a game like hockey or something like that, it's like you're likely to score pretty much the entire time an equal amount. You can pull your goalie, it increases it marginally. But in football, you can like basically just like we said, increase your like take much more risk, throw the ball like super long to get this like 7 point outcome. And yeah, you're risking it, but you're already going to lose, right? So I think in this way, like how does that do that in a game? And it doesn't really, right? It just makes it more competitive. It makes it a little bit more complex, which is cool. I mean, I generally feel like the complexity addition to this is cool to a certain extent. But how does it make it so that the end game, like you can just, I guess, the speed up, um, no, it doesn't have that luck chance.
Yeah, I mean, probably if I was, I mean, from my limited experience with Stumble Guys, I'd look at more random stuff than rather than like ranked things. But where I mean, it's a pretty narrow thing. If you're designing like a hardcore skill game, you better figure out how to monetize. Like if you're designing, like for instance, if you were the person that made chess, you knew you were going to monetize this for a couple thousand years, so you weren't too worried about it. The ARPU of chess is not great.
Well, chess.com is crushing it. So,
Yeah.
uh,
Okay. Yeah. Sorry. Yeah, but
Right.
ARPU, we got to take all of the years it's existed and divide by,
Oh, interesting.
that
LTV of
down.
the game. I mean, they did start in like medieval times, so like I don't know if you
Yeah.
can.
But I mean,
Well,
leaderboards
and
also,
if
there's
you create
leaderboard.
well, if you included the LTV of like future growth, I think chess would because it's
Yes.
like the longevity of it is
Yeah,
like we've really
yeah.
gone off topic here, guys.
Real quick on leaderboards though.
Yeah.
There's leaderboards in Royal Match, and notice that the times of them are all very, very short. Like the lightning or whatever thing that they have, it's like an hour or whatever. I mean, that's one of the ways to casualize leaderboards. Cut the time down a ton. Because even if like you play the game
Mm.
a lot more than me and you're better than me, maybe you're at work and I can beat you right now. So
Well,
that's
it's not
that's
just
one
the
way to do it.
time. It's not just the time. It's that the amount that's different from the first person, the second person, and the 1000th person is much smaller and contained,
Mm.
right? It's
Yeah,
almost like saying like, in poker, there's a set amount of coins in the ecosystem or something. I don't even know how you would do it in poker,
yeah,
but you're somehow creating it so that like there's going to be a million people at 90, right? And then there's going to
yeah,
be like 500,000 at 92, and the top is 100. And that then
yeah.
makes it much more relevant. Like 1 second, like one more second gets you up the leaderboard. And yeah. So that's an
Yeah.
interesting way of countering it. Now we're talking about leaderboards. Okay. Um, this has been amazing. I think this topic, I kind of expected that we were only going to talk about one thing because, of course, Joseph Kim had nothing to say throughout this. So, it was only three of us. That's obviously, and, I didn't know what I was going to get into, but yeah, Jennifer's on here. We got to note this. It's like always more people. We are definitely going to blast this on LinkedIn and stuff in terms of video. I thought this discussion was incredible. I didn't even show many of the slides, but I thought this was awesome. I got I learned a ton. I really enjoyed it. And unless you guys have anything else to add, I think this is probably a wrap for this discussion. I could talk all day though.
No, thanks for putting this together, Brett. I think this feature, as well as the other one, really cool. So I'm just thankful that you're covering this stuff and that you invited me to participate. So appreciate the content.
Pleasure having you guys. Yeah. All right. Thank you, everybody.
Sorry.
Thank you very much, Brett.
Yep.